So I've been asked to speak about food security, food safety and healthy nutrition, and are these things compatible? And I've worked in this area to some extent before, but I haven't actually really thought about this question, are these three things compatible? So it was a really, really good challenge to get given this topic. So are they compatible? My answer to this is both yes as well as no. And the no part, I think, is really where our challenge lies. So in this presentation, I'm going to describe both the compatibility and the tensions that I think exist between these three concepts. And this helps to then provide a framework for thinking about how to achieve coherent food policy. And when I was putting this presentation together, I decided, I was enjoying it so much, I guess, that I wanted to write a commentary article alongside it. And I got these three co-authors involved with putting the manuscript together. So I'd like also to acknowledge their input into what I'm presenting today. So what are these three food and nutrition related areas? I'm going to start with a few definitions. So food safety addresses foodborne illness, and it covers the handling, the preparation and the storage of food. And these foodborne illnesses, they could be caused by viruses, bacteria, parasites or perhaps chemical substances. So a salmonella outbreak or the melamine scandal of 2008 would both be considered issues of food safety. Healthy nutrition, I don't think I really need to go into too much detail about. Everyone here is pretty familiar with that. And of course, this is the one that particularly relates to malnutrition in all its forms, both underweight and micronutrient deficiencies, as well as overweight, obesity, and non-communicable disease. And then food security, in contrast, this has been described as a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, social and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food to meet dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy lifestyle. So it encompasses both food safety and healthy nutrition, but it also relates to this wider set of objectives or concerns about the availability, the access, utilisation and stability of the food supply. And these have been described as the four pillars of food security by the FAO. So this is about food being available, about it being accessible, and it's got concerns about the stability or sustainability of the food system. So there are clearly differences between these three things, but they're each key aspects of food systems, and they've all got important implications for population health. So they are all essential components of healthy food systems. And there have been lots of frameworks drawn up depicting what a food system actually is. They all look quite different, but these three things generally fit into all of these frameworks. So this framework here is of the food system. It was developed by the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition. It was developed in 2017 or published in 2017. And you can see that we've got aspects relating across the bottom to food security. Food safety comes up in the middle along with healthy nutrition, and that is about the quality and the diversity of diets. So conceptually, all of these three elements of food systems are conceptually they're very, very compatible. But whilst they are conceptually compatible, implementing interventions to address the three objectives is very political, and so very much a political challenge as well as technical. And by political, I mean that it concerns the distribution of resources and power both within countries and also between countries. And it involves decisions made by international institutions and by state governments. So these three issues, they're sometimes thought about as being a single process or part of a single set of objectives, and that's there are terms that bring them together, like food and nutrition security, but food security, food safety, and healthy nutrition, they have different characteristics, which means that they are considered differently and prioritised differently by policymakers. So a bit about political prioritisation. Obviously, policymakers don't have infinite resources. They've got to prioritise which issues get addressed, which issues don't, or at least don't at the moment. And to get addressed, issues need both political prioritisation, and then they need, after that, the allocation of resources that are big enough to actually address the issue. But policymaking is not this straightforward, rational, perhaps ideally evidence-based process. It's very complex, it's not considered to be linear, it's very messy. And policymakers are pulled between different concurrent policy challenges, and each issue will have advocates who are able to cite evidence to suggest why, suggest that the issue is sizable enough to need to be addressed and warrants a government response. So to understand why some issues get onto the political agenda and others don't, Schiffman and Smith outlined 4 areas that shape the priority that an issue receives on the political agenda. So these being actor power, ideas, which is about the way that actors involved with the issue understand the issue and portray the issue. The political context obviously shapes the prioritisation that an issue gets. And also issue characteristics. So this is about whether there are credible indicators that exist for the problem, whether the problem is considered by those indicators to be severe or not, and perhaps whether effective interventions exist to address it. Because if effective interventions don't exist, then it's less likely that an issue is going to be prioritised on the political agenda. So these things are all considered to shape the prioritisation that issues receive. So to relate this framework briefly to the 3 areas from food systems, if we take the bottom domain, issue characteristics, then policymakers respond very differently to immediate issues, urgent issues, such as food safety with its acute effects on health and well-being, than they do to longer-term or more chronic issues like healthy nutrition. And if you think about the ideas domain, then you could consider the characteristics of food security, so the emphasis on availability, access, system stability. These are very different to the characteristics of the other 2 issues, and these characteristics have got really strong resonance with some decision makers because of their implications for national security. And they've got resonance with some very powerful decision makers as well, so that brings in the actor power part of it. So a little bit more detail on each issue. If we start with food safety, this is the acute or short-term issue. So it's been observed that decision makers prioritise short-term over longer-term issues that may go beyond electoral cycles. So food safety, with its acute characteristic, its potential to disrupt export markets for countries, it often receives quite high prioritisation on the political agenda. It receives international standards, domestic regulation for food safety, and these are quite strongly enforced. So you could consider the WTO's sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, which addresses food safety. And then domestic regulations are also often more stringent than what you would see internationally. And this is to ensure that imported food won't result in foodborne illnesses and disrupt a country's health, economy, environment, perhaps. And whilst food safety has these strong regulatory measures implemented at national and international levels, there aren't such strong regulatory measures that have been implemented for healthy or unhealthy nutrition at either level, despite the high increasing levels of overweight and obesity in most countries over recent decades. So there is no strong global mechanism for addressing unhealthy diets. At national level, of course, some governments have implemented fiscal measures to address the consumption of unhealthy foods, so things like soda taxes have been implemented. But on the whole, I think it's fair to say that most governments have, if they've implemented anything, it's been approaches with little chance of success, at least in isolation. So things like education and perhaps they support industry self-regulation. So, of course, these things are very important. I'm not saying education is not important, but it's not going to make a huge dent in healthy eating on its own. So it would have to be implemented alongside comprehensive structural measures that address the production, availability, processing and marketing of foods. And I think Philip James had a very nice slide to show that as well. And then we've got food security. So this is the issue that often features in debates about national and regional security, with the EU Common Agricultural Policy an example of this. And this relevance to national security contributes to the high priority of food security on national political agendas. So agriculture, alongside coal and steel, was one of the core policy areas that was selected to base the development on European economic and political integration in the 50s, in part due to the role of agriculture and heavy industry in war. And the idea was that countries with integrated food supplies would be less likely or less able to go to war. In more recent times, EU countries and some other high-income countries like the US have really strongly protected their farmers from external competition. And this type of protectionism, it reflects not just the vested interests and the strong political organisation of the farming lobbies, but it also reflects the wider concerns that decision makers have about national security, and therefore the need to address food security and protect domestic supplies. So this high prioritisation of food security is happening today in high-income countries, but it is arguably most appropriate in a context of significant food shortages and hunger in a country. So if we take Malawi, which is a fairly small country in Southeast Africa, but it does have a pretty high population of 19 million people, malnutrition levels in Malawi are fairly high, and there are significant challenges with food safety. And both of these issues are on the political agenda, but it is food security that is most highly prioritised. So the Malawian government has introduced over the years quite a range of agricultural input subsidy programs, and these are programs that subsidise, make it cheaper for poor farmers to buy fertiliser and seed. And the most prominent of these was the 2005-06 Farm Input Subsidy Programme. So, or the FISP. So the FISP is a large-scale national program. I can't remember what proportion of the agricultural budget it is, but it's huge. The main objectives are to increase maize production, promote household food security, and enhance rural incomes. And while lots of high-income countries, as Philip James also picked up on, subsidise their farmers extensively, Malawi was criticised for doing this. But the donor community were initially quite opposed to this program being implemented, but they did later change their mind about it. And the FISP has been considered quite a success, with Malawi achieving its biggest ever maize harvest in 2006, and then was able to export some of its maize surplus. So the FISP has been considered quite a success, but its impact is debated. And over time, the FISP has evolved. So it was initially targeting maize seed, maize fertiliser, supporting farmers to grow maize. But it now targets legumes as well as maize. So this crop diversity approach is to try to improve dietary diversity and contribute to healthy nutrition, as well as of course, keeping the food security objective. But food security still is the primary food-related target of the policy. So I think you can see that in a range of contexts, food security is often prioritised over food safety, and food safety then over healthy nutrition. And if you consider a resource or a particularly resource-constrained country like Malawi, then where most of the population is quite food insecure, then this kind of focus can be perhaps obvious or possibly quite appropriate. But even in Malawi, obesity and I guess NCDs are related to healthy nutrition. These are now affecting substantial proportions of the population. In high-income contexts, healthy nutrition is, of course, increasingly getting political attention, given high levels of obesity. But it's, I guess, also worth mentioning that significant proportions of populations in high-income countries, the UK, for example, significant proportions are food insecure. And these three issues also have quite a lot in common in regard to their health outcomes. So a lot of issues with individual and community malnutrition and food security, they're actually a result of varying combinations of these three things, including food safety, which has effects on nutrient absorption. So there's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of synergy between these three food system issues and their health outcomes. And in all instances, their causes are at least partly political in nature. So just in conclusion, these three aspects of food systems, I think we can quite safely say they're compatible and they're very complementary in principle. And they've got important synergies between them in terms of their impact on population health outcomes. But in terms of their politics, they're much less compatible, and there are a lot of trade-offs between them that are quite evident. So governments are often prioritising food security over food safety, perhaps at the expense of healthy nutrition. And the appropriateness of these sorts of trade-offs differs between different country and regional contexts. So you might have better ideas than I do about how this relates to you personally. I think for me, the challenge for food systems researchers and advocates is to find ways to try to improve the compatibility of healthy nutrition with food security and with food safety from the political perspective, and increase the interest in healthy nutrition on the political agenda. So this is really about the development of food security and food safety measures that at the same time address the goal of achieving healthy nutrition within healthy and sustainable food systems. Thanks.